Winterfell was no place for a boy who looked like a Targaryen. From the moment Jon Snow could walk, the stairs followed him. The bastard of Winterfell was supposed to look like his father, black of hair, gray of eyes, a child of the north. Instead, Jon had hair like fallen snow, nearly white under the winter sun, and eyes that shimmered with an unnatural violet hue. Lady Catelyn Stark despised him. That was nothing new, but the look in her eyes whenever she saw him wasn't just resentment, it was suspicion. "He doesn't look like Ned," she had whispered to Maester Luwin once, though Jon had only half heard it. He had been young, maybe 4 or 5, but the words stayed with him. "Lord Stark brought him back from war," Luwin had replied cautiously. "The boy is his blood." But even Jon could tell Catelyn did not believe that. The others were no better. The Stark children had always been kind in their own way. Robb, the brother he wished he could truly call brother, and Arya, the only one who saw him as more than his shame. But the servants, the lords who visited, the men of the north who swore their loyalty to House Stark, they all looked at him as if he did not belong. And he didn't. He knew what they saw, a Targaryen in Winterfell. The whispers followed him like ghosts, dragon spawn, a silver snake among wolves. If Robert Baratheon ever lays eyes on him, he'll be dead before sunrise. Jon didn't understand all of it, not yet, but he knew enough. Jon learned early that he was different, but it wasn't just the whispers or the way people looked at him. It was the way they acted. He had heard of bastards before, had even met a few in Winterfell's courtyard when their fathers brought them along for training. They were treated with mild disdain, sometimes pity, but never outright fear. Jon, however, was different. He saw the way Lord Umber hesitated when speaking to him, how Great Jon's men watched him warily. He noticed how Lady Mormont stiffened whenever he passed by. And then there was Theon Greyjoy, a hostage raised alongside Robb, arrogant, smug Theon, who acted as if he were the true son of Winterfell, despite his own status as a glorified prisoner. "Bet your mother was some Valyrian whore," Theon sneered once, after a long day in the yard. "Or maybe you're not even a bastard at all. Maybe Stark found you in a dragon's egg." Jon had lunged at him before he could think, fists flying, rage boiling over. He was younger than Theon, smaller, but he fought like a cornered direwolf, teeth bared. It had taken Robb and 2 guards to pull him away, and still Jon seethed. Theon's words had cut deeper than any blade, not because they were cruel, because Jon feared they might be true. Jon never asked his father about his mother, not directly. He had tried once when he was 6, tugging on the edge of Lord Eddard's cloak, looking up with eyes too much like Lyanna's for Ned's comfort. "Who was she?" Jon had asked, voice small but filled with hope. His father had only looked at him, face like stone. She was of no consequence. It was a lie. Even at 6, Jon could tell. So he stopped asking. Instead, he searched for clues. He had read books about Valyria in the Maester's library, about the noble houses of the freehold before it fell, the silver-haired dragon lords who could command beasts with a whisper, the royal line of House Targaryen, so proud of their blood, they wed brother to sister to keep it pure. Jon had traced his fingers over the inked illustrations, staring at the faces of long-dead kings and princes, people who looked like him. He asked old Nan, once, if there had ever been a Targaryen who found their way to the north. She had only cackled and ruffled his hair. "Aye, long ago, boy, but dragons don't fare well in the cold." Neither do I, Jon had thought. The year Jon turned 10, everything changed. King Robert Baratheon arrived in Winterfell in a storm of noise and gold. The king was loud, boisterous, a man who filled the great hall with his presence alone. His men followed suit: Sir Jaime Lannister, golden and arrogant; Queen Cersei, cold and calculating. And then there was Prince Joffrey, who sneered at everything he saw. Jon was not meant to be in the hall that night. He had lingered near the entrance, watching from the shadows, until he saw Robert clap a hand on his father's shoulder and laugh. It was a sound full of old memories and forgotten debts. And then the king's eyes swept the room, over the banners, the lords, the Stark children, until they landed on him. Jon had seen war-hardened men before, had seen Lord Stark's face when he prepared for battle, had watched the direwolves hunt in the Godswood, but he had never seen anything like the way Robert Baratheon looked at him, like a man who had seen a ghost. For a moment, the hall felt too quiet, the air too heavy. The king's face twisted, shock, suspicion, then something uglier, something Jon didn't understand. Then just as quickly, Robert looked away, draining his cup as if nothing had happened. Jon knew then that he was in danger. Jon couldn't sleep that night. The way King Robert had looked at him was burned into his mind. He wasn't just a bastard in Robert's eyes. He was something worse, something dangerous. Lying in his chambers, staring at the wooden beams above, Jon thought of all the things he had heard about King Robert, how he had ended the Targaryen dynasty with war and fire, how he had shattered Rhaegar Targaryen's chest on the battlefield, how he had hunted down every last trace of dragon's blood to keep his throne safe. And now Robert had seen him. Jon wasn't a fool. He had always known he didn't look like the other Stark children. He had Ned's shape, his quiet nature, but not his features. He had thought, perhaps, that his mother had been from the south, that maybe she had the blood of old Valyria, some lost noblewoman with silver hair. But the way Robert had looked at him, no, that wasn't how one looked at a bastard. That was how one looked at an enemy. Jon turned onto his side and clenched his fists. Had his father noticed? Had Robert said anything? The next morning, Jon watched Lord Stark closely at breakfast, but his father was as unreadable as ever. There was no sign of worry on his face, no hint that anything was wrong. Still, something gnawed at Jon's gut. He had spent his life being ignored, pushed aside. He had learned to stay out of the way, to accept that he was nothing more than the bastard of Winterfell. But now the king of the Seven Kingdoms had looked at him as if he were something else entirely. Jon needed answers. He found his father in the Godswood that evening, standing before the heart tree, his head bowed. The red leaves rustled in the wind, the carved face weeping its endless stream of crimson sap. "Father," Jon said hesitantly. Eddard Stark turned, his gray eyes unreadable. "Jon." For a moment Jon hesitated. He had never been good with words, never had the confidence that Robb carried so effortlessly. But he couldn't ignore what had happened in the Great Hall. "Why did the king look at me like that?" Jon asked finally. His father stiffened, just slightly, but Jon caught it. "You imagined it," Ned said, turning back toward the tree. "I didn't," Jon insisted. "He knew something. He was afraid of me." Ned exhaled through his nose, long and slow. When he finally turned to face Jon again, there was something different in his expression. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. "You must never speak of this again," Ned said, his voice quiet but firm. "Do you understand me?" Jon's stomach twisted. "Why? What am I?" Ned reached forward and gripped Jon's shoulder, his fingers tight, almost desperate. "You are my son," Ned said. That is all you need to know. But Jon didn't believe him. Not anymore. Jon had always been good at moving unseen. He wasn't Bran, who could climb where no one else dared. He wasn't Arya, quick as a shadow. But he had learned how to go unnoticed, how to make himself small. And that was how he overheard the Queen. It was the day after Robert's arrival. Jon had been passing through one of the side corridors near the Great Hall when he heard voices, sharp, hushed. He recognized his father's tone first, low and steady, but it was the woman's voice that made him stop. Queen Cersei. You should have killed it, she was saying. You still should. Jon pressed himself against the stone wall, heart pounding. I will not hear this, Ned said, his voice tight with anger. You saw how Robert looked at him, Cersei hissed. He's not blind, Ned. That is no Snow. That is no bastard of yours. And Robert will put a sword through his heart the moment he's sure. Jon felt his chest go tight. You forget yourself, Ned said coldly. There was a long pause, then a quiet laugh. Do I? You're a fool if you think Robert's mercy will last. You can't hide him forever. I will do what I must, Ned said. Jon swallowed hard and hurried away before he could hear more. Jon's breath came fast as he walked through the stone corridors of Winterfell, the Queen's words echoing in his skull. You should have killed it. You can't hide him forever. He felt sick. He had always been unwanted, but this was different. This wasn't the bitterness of Lady Stark or the taunts of Theon Greyjoy. This was something deeper, something deadly. The Queen wanted him dead, and his father, his honorable, just father, was hiding something. Jon barely noticed where his feet were taking him until he found himself in the courtyard. The sky was darkening, the torches burning bright against the cold wind. He saw Robb practicing his swordplay with Sir Roderick, laughing when he landed a strike. He saw Theon standing nearby, smirking as if he owned the place. This was their home, their birthright, but not his. Jon's hands clenched at his sides. He needed to know the truth. It wasn't until weeks later, after King Robert had left and the castle had settled once more, that Jon found himself at the wall. The cold of the north was nothing new to him, but the wall was different. The air here carried a weight, a silence that pressed down on him as heavily as the questions in his mind. The Night's Watch was meant to be a brotherhood, a place where pasts were forgotten, but even here Jon could not escape his own. It was Samwell Tarly who finally said what no one else would. I read about them once, Sam said quietly, sitting beside Jon in the dim candlelight of the library. The Targaryens. They were different. Their blood was special. Jon looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Sam hesitated. The Valyrians were not like other men. Some say they were more dragon than human. They wed only their own kind, keeping their bloodline pure. And their children? He glanced at Jon's silver hair, at the sharp contrast against the black of his cloak. They were unmistakable. Jon swallowed hard. You think Sam sighed. I think you don't look like a Stark. Jon had no answer for that. Ghost had always been different from the other direwolves. Larger, smarter, and, like Jon, an outcast among his own. Jon often found himself walking beyond the wall with Ghost padding silently beside him, the white of his fur blending into the snow. It was during one of these walks that Jon found the fire. It had been left by someone, wildlings perhaps, but there was something strange about it. The wood had burned too hot, the embers still glowing long after they should have gone cold. Ghost sniffed at it cautiously, growling low in his throat. Jon crouched down and ran his fingers through the ash. It was warm, but there was something else, something deep in his bones, a pull, like the fire knew him, like it recognized his blood. Jon pulled his hand back, heart pounding. He wasn't just a Stark, and if the fire could feel it, who else would? The discovery of the fire unsettled John more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just that the embers had burned unnaturally hot, or that the warmth had lingered longer than it should have. It was the way he had felt it, deep in his bones, in his blood. He had always known he was different, but this was something more, something unnatural. Ghost had sensed it too. The dire wolf stayed close, his crimson eyes locked on John as if waiting for something to happen. That night John barely slept. He tossed and turned in his cot, the cold air of Castle Black biting at his skin. His dreams were filled with flames, roaring fires that turned the sky red, dragons soaring over blackened fields, a shadowy figure with silver hair standing at the edge of a battlefield. When he woke, his skin was slick with sweat, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had dreamed of dragons before, but this felt different. This felt like a memory. The next day, a raven arrived from Winterfell. It carried a message from Maester Lewin, addressed to Lord Commander Mormont. John wasn't supposed to see it, but Sam did. "I think you should read this," Sam whispered, slipping the parchment into John's hand when no one was looking. John hesitated, then unfolded the letter. His eyes moved quickly over the words, his breath catching in his throat. "The king is dead. The realm is in chaos. The queen knows." John's fingers tightened around the parchment. The king? Dead? Robert Baratheon was gone. John swallowed hard. The letter didn't mention him directly, but he could feel it, like an unspoken warning hidden between the lines. The queen knows. Knows what? That he was at the wall? That he was still alive? That he wasn't just some nameless bastard? John forced himself to stay calm, but his hands trembled. He needed to speak to the Lord Commander. He needed to know what this meant. But deep down, he already had an idea. His time at the wall might not last much longer. The storm came 2 nights later, a wildling raid. A group of deserters had tried to flee south, but the Night's Watch had caught them before they could cross the wall. John was among the men sent to deal with them. The fight was brutal, fast. The cold made movements sluggish, swords clashing under the pale light of the moon. John fought alongside his brothers, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Ghost was a blur of white, his teeth flashing as he tore into a wildling's throat. Then John saw him, the leader of the deserters, a tall man with a cruel smile, a knife in his hand. He moved fast, too fast, and before John could react, the man was on him. A blade flashed. John felt the sharp sting of steel cutting into his side. Pain exploded through him, fire and ice clashing in his veins. He fell to his knees, gasping. And then, something happened. The pain in his side burned, but it wasn't like any wound he had felt before. It wasn't just pain, it was heat. Like the fire he had touched in the snow, like the dreams that haunted him. John clenched his teeth, gripping his sword tight. He should have been too weak to stand. He should have been dying, but instead he felt stronger. His blood boiled, his skin burned, and when he looked up, the deserter took a step back, eyes wide with fear. John didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, driving his blade deep into the man's chest. The deserter choked, gasping. His eyes darted to John's wound, to the place where he had stabbed him. John followed his gaze. The cut was there. He could see the torn fabric, the slickness of blood. But it wasn't bleeding anymore. The wound was closing, healing. John's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't normal. This wasn't human. The deserter collapsed, lifeless. The battle was over. The others were cheering, but John barely heard them. Ghost trotted up to his side, sniffing at his wound, then looking up at him with knowing eyes. John met his gaze. Neither of them needed to say it. Something inside him had changed, or maybe something inside him had awakened. John sat on the edge of his cot, staring at his hands. They weren't shaking, though they should have been. He had seen men go pale with fear after battle, their hands trembling as they tried to forget the feeling of blood on their blades. But John wasn't afraid. He was something worse. He was curious. The wound on his side should have taken weeks to heal, should have festered in the cold of the wall. But it hadn't. Instead, it had closed within hours, leaving only a faint scar. John exhaled sharply and pulled his cloak tighter. Ghost sat by his feet, watching. The direwolf knew. John had always felt a connection to Ghost, something deeper than mere companionship. But now that bond felt stronger. He could feel Ghost's presence even when they weren't together, as if their souls were tied by something unseen, something ancient, something dangerous. Sam had been watching him carefully since the battle. John could see it in his eyes, the way he hesitated, the way he kept looking at John's side as if expecting the wound to return. It was only a matter of time before Sam asked. I found something, Sam said one night, his voice hesitant. In the old books. John looked up. Sam swallowed, then placed a thick, dust-covered tome on the table between them. The pages were yellowed with age, the leather cover cracked from years of neglect. John ran his fingers over the surface. What is it? Sam hesitated. It's about the blood of old Valyria, about the magic they had. John's stomach twisted. Magic? Sam nodded. The Targaryens. They weren't just dragon lords. Some believed they had fire in their veins, that their blood gave them strength beyond ordinary men. Some said they could heal faster, survive wounds that would kill others, even walk through fire. John stiffened. Sam licked his lips. I saw your wound, John. I saw how fast it healed. John said nothing. Sam leaned closer. I don't think you're just a bastard. I think you might be something more. John clenched his fists. He had spent his whole life trying to belong, trying to be a Stark even when the world refused to let him. But now the truth was clawing its way to the surface, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to know it. The raven arrived at dawn. John had been tending to Ghost when the bird landed on the frost-covered railing, its black eyes gleaming. The scroll tied to its leg bore the Stark sigil. His heart pounded as he unrolled the parchment. Come home. That was all it said. No explanation, no signature, just 2 words. John frowned. His father would never send such a vague message. If something had happened, Maester Lewin would have written it. Robb would have sent more. Something was wrong. John looked to Ghost. The direwolf was alert, ears perked, as if sensing the shift in the air. The wall had been his refuge, a place to hide from the truth. But now the truth was calling him home, and John wasn't sure he could ignore it any longer. John rode south with Ghost at his side, the wall shrinking behind him with every mile. He hadn't told Lord Commander Mormont the real reason he was leaving. Only that duty called him home. Mormont had been reluctant to let him go, but in the end, the old bear had relented. John had no escort, no banners, no honor to claim, just the wind at his back and a growing storm in his chest. The letter had been too strange, too short. Come home. 2 words. That wasn't his father's way. It wasn't Robb's either. And then there was Sam's warning. Some believed they had fire in their veins, that their blood gave them strength beyond ordinary men. John flexed his fingers in the cold. He had felt it, that fire. He had seen the way his wound had closed like it was nothing. He had spent his life believing he was a Stark, but now the truth was whispering to him in ways he could no longer ignore. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it meant, but he would find out soon enough. John had almost reached the outskirts of Winterfell when he saw them, riders in the distance, moving fast. He pulled his horse to a stop, narrowing his eyes against the snow. Ghost let out a low growl. There were 4 of them, cloaked figures on black horses, their sigils hidden. But Jon didn't need banners to know who they served. The queen knew. Cersei's words echoed in his mind. You can't hide him forever. Jon reached for his sword, but the riders did not charge. Instead, they split apart, flanking him from both sides. One of them spoke. You are summoned to King's Landing. Jon tensed. His fingers curled around the hilt of Longclaw. By who? The rider's voice was flat. By the queen. Jon's jaw tightened. I serve no queen. A beat of silence. Then the rider pulled back his hood, revealing a face Jon did not expect to see. Sir Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer. Jon's grip on his sword tightened. Jaime smirked. You look more like him than I expected. Jon's breath hitched. Who? Jaime's smirk faded. Come with us, or don't. But either way, you won't like what you find in Winterfell. Jon exchanged a look with Ghost. The direwolf bared his teeth. Jon turned back to Jaime. Tell me what's happened. Jaime's expression was unreadable. Your father is dead. Jon's body went rigid. The cold wind howled through the trees. The world blurred around him. No, he whispered. Jaime's voice was calm. Ned Stark was executed by order of King Joffrey. Jon felt the fire rise inside him, a burning heat that made his fingers tremble. Jaime studied him carefully. Now, do you want to come with us? Or would you rather die in the snow? Jon swallowed his grief, his rage. Winterfell could wait. First, he had a queen to meet. Jon rode south under the queen's watchful eye. The journey to King's Landing was long and cold, but the fire inside him burned hotter with each passing mile. His father was dead. Ned Stark, the man who had raised him, had been executed like a traitor. Jon had always believed that if he had nothing else, he at least had his honor. But honor hadn't saved his father, and now he was riding into the den of lions. Jaime Lannister rode beside him, silent for most of the journey. When he did speak, his words were sharp, deliberate. You should know, Jaime said one evening, as they camped beneath the pale light of the moon. Cersei wanted you dead the moment she laid eyes on you. Jon said nothing. Jaime smirked. But someone else wants to see you first. Jon narrowed his eyes. Who? Jaime studied him for a moment before answering. Your aunt. Jon stiffened. I don't have an aunt. Jaime raised an eyebrow. No? Then I suppose I imagined the silver-haired girl who crossed the narrow sea. Jon's blood turned to ice. Daenerys. He had heard the name before, whispered in the dark corners of Winterfell. The last Targaryen, the Dragon Queen. And now she was waiting for him. King's Landing was suffocating. The smell of rot and filth clung to the streets, the air thick with smoke and whispers. Jon was led through the Red Keep, past the golden-armored Lannister guards, past the halls where his father had walked before his death. And then he saw her. Daenerys Stormborn sat upon the Iron Throne. Her hair was silver, her skin pale beneath the torchlight. She was smaller than he expected, but her presence filled the room like a storm. And her eyes, violet, sharp as dragonfire, locked onto his with a look Jon did not understand. So, she said softly, you're the one they hid. Jon swallowed, his throat dry. I don't know who I am. Daenerys tilted her head. Then let me tell you. She stood descending the steps of the throne, her gown trailing behind her. You are Jon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, blood of the dragon. The words struck like a blade to the chest. Jon shook his head. Number, I am Ned Stark's son. Daenerys smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. Number, you are not. Jon clenched his fists. Why am I here? Daenerys studied him carefully. Because the game is not over. My brother was a fool, but he was right about one thing. Our family was meant to rule. And you, Jon, you are the last piece of the puzzle. Jon felt his stomach twist. King Robert is dead, Daenerys continued. Joffrey is a monster. The North will never follow him. But they might follow you. Jon exhaled sharply. I never wanted a crown. Daenerys stepped closer. Neither did I. But what we want doesn't matter. She placed a hand on his chest, just above his heart. What matters is the blood that runs through your veins. Jon met her gaze, his mind reeling. He thought of the fire in his bones, the way his wounds had healed, the dreams that haunted him. He thought of his father, his real father, and for the first time in his life, Jon Snow knew exactly who he was. Not a Stark, not a bastard, a dragon, and dragons did not bow.